Our lead panelist is Ted Dysert, Vice Chairman and Global Leader of the Global Board of Directors practice at HEIDRICK & Struggles. Ted has placed more than 600 executives on the boards of Fortune 500, mid-cap, and private corporations. Tracy Zhu is Associate Professor of Finance here at the Daniels College of Business. Tracy's research focuses on corporate finance, international finance, and corporate governance. She earned her PhD from the University of Washington and her MA in economics from The Ohio State University. MarkJensen is an independent director and chair of the audit committee for several companies, including Lattice Semiconductor Corporation, a NASDAQ-traded company, Forescout Technologies, a private company, and Control4, another publicly traded company. Mark has also served as U.S. Managing Partner for Audit and Enterprise Risk Services for the technology industry, and as U.S. Managing Partner for the Venture Capital Services Group, both with Deloitte. So let's get into it. Ted, will you start it off with some comments about governing for long-term performance from the lofty perch of the NACD Blue Ribbon Committee, and whatever else you may have to say about it.
Right.
Ted Dysert.
My wife jokes this is a TED Talk, only it's not as entertaining. But first off, I'm incredibly privileged to be here with you all today. What Dan has done here with the Institute for Enterprise Ethics is really fantastic, and I also want to thank Bill Heck for suggesting me as a panelist, and also recognize my partner Ron Brown, who's sort of our lead in the market here as well. So thanks for all that you do here. You know, in preparation for our time today, I pulled up a list of some of the top performing stocks over the last 25 years, figuring that's at least an approximation for long-term value creation. And not all the companies are well known or built to stand the test of time, but they include names like Danaher, United Health Group, Cisco, Microsoft, Best Buy, Oracle, Home Depot, Precision Castparts, Harley-Davidson, and of course, Berkshire Hathaway. Time after time, these are the types of companies that deliver on their short-term objectives, but never lose sight of the future. It is never a question of short-term versus long-term, but it is always a question about how we meet our goals in the short-term and the long-term. So we're here today to discuss long-term value creation and the things that boards can do to help create long-term value. It's timely and relevant given the hyper-focus of the past several years on the short-term. The meet 'em or beat 'em analyst guidelines and fears of activist investors have tracked with the recent growth and success of activist campaigns. And with interest rates so low, everyone is chasing a return, and almost no one can figure out where they're going to get it. Some activists are out there, frankly, to put lipstick on a pig. Let's generate nothing more than a short-term pop on the stock price, repurchase stock, spin off a division, merge it with another company. But you know, my philosophy is how does this really fix a company? In fact, putting two poor performers together to me is sort of akin to propping two drunks up against one another and applauding them for standing up. But there are different types of activists out there. You know, I've had close interaction with Nelson Peltz and the group at Trian Funds, and their playbook is not always the same in each situation, and they're not always as positive as this situation, but I've had close interactions with the board at H.J. Heinz, and what had happened there was a typical case where people started chasing short-term returns. So they realized at the outset that they were going to miss the quarter, and so what did they do to rein in to miss the quarter? They cut their marketing spending. And when they cut their marketing spending, their revenue for the next quarter declined, and then they chased that number after that, and it kept going and it kept going. And Nelson ran a very public proxy campaign, but when he ended up on the board, he basically said, look, I'm one of your largest shareholders, and I think this is stupid. Let's just go out and reset expectations with the streets. Let's double down and reinvest in our marketing spend and get this ship headed back in the right direction. And apropos of that today, obviously the company was acquired by 3G in a transaction that was very strong for shareholders. But the CEO and the CFO both serve on the advisory board of Trian today based on that experience and their mindset of how they show up and how they engage constructively with the management teams. Now, not all activists or investors behave in the same way, and I'm not arguing that. But companies create opportunity for an opportunistic investor or outside acquirer when their short-term results and stock performance are out of line with the external market. So I had the privilege of participating on this NACD Blue Ribbon Commission on the board and long-term value creation. It was published in 2015 and co-chaired by Karen Horn and Bill McCracken. And from my perspective, based on the dialogue that we had and the format that these commissions come together, is they basically facilitate a dialogue amongst about 20 to 25 thought leaders in the space. And then they've got an incredibly talented group of writers who work and sort of synthesize those conversations. And then the Blue Ribbon Commission panel members get to edit and massage the material back and forth. So not every commissioner signs off on the entirety of the content, but there's good consensus around the direction and what's out there to be said. And it's on the website for the NACD if you want to go to nacdonline.org and read the 41 pages, but I'm going to give you a little bit of the cliff notes around that. So clearly those long-term value and short-term goals should be in alignment rather than conflict. As the report recommends, and I'll quote here, companies need to maintain a direct connection between short-term viability and long-term value creation. The board's role is to ensure that this alignment is well established and clearly articulated by management. And I think that's really interesting in today's environment. About a month ago, I met with a CEO who was talking about how he saw his role in the drive for performance. And he said, if I do my job correctly, I'm betting my job every 2 to 3 years. And I have to be comfortable with that. But it's the board's job to make sure that I'm not betting the company at the same time. And I think that's that balance on long-term value creation and risk management that has to happen. Now, the commission report outlines 6 ways that board members can help align short-term and long-term success. And forgive me if I end up plodding along here, but these are the to-do sections of the report. And once again, you can go back and read all 41 pages, but I'll just take you quickly through the piece here. So they say to encourage stronger, clear alignment between short-term activities and long-term goals, the commission recommends that directors assess their current practices in the following 6 areas. Number 1, CEO selection, evaluation, and succession planning. The board's role in CEO selection and evaluation process should include an assessment of the extent to which he or she is an effective advocate for the firm's long-term strategy. I think the reality is nothing the board will work on will overcome the wrong selection of a CEO. The right person with the right experiences and the right leadership traits will trump all other things that your board may tackle. I think it is the paramount and the number one thing that a board may do. And whether you've got the right strategy or not, if you bring in the right leader, he or she will take you through a process that will get to something that will create value, engaging with your team. Number 2, discussions about strategy and performance goals. To enhance discussions on short-term and long-term strategy, board members should seek information about the business environment, the company's relative performance, and emerging risks and opportunities from a range of internal and external sources. An outside-in viewpoint, in my opinion, will always trump an inside-out viewpoint. It doesn't matter if your company is returning 5% or 10% gains if the external market is 15% or more. Make sure you're always gathering data from the outside. And the reality is your outside investors can't sit in the boardroom. They can only analyze your company from the outside in, based on the data that they have available. So I often say with a board, if you put 12 smart people around the table and give them the same input, which is information coming from management, within some gates we're going to come to the same conclusions. And many of the outside activist investors will say, look, if you're only listening to management, you're probably the least informed person in the room. So attend industry conferences. Make sure you go to your investor days. Make sure that you go to the other programs that your company's presenting to and understand the market for your customers, for your suppliers, and for your competitors. Number 3, capital allocation decisions. Boards should ensure that major capital allocation and annual budget decisions reflect long-term strategic objectives as well as short-term priorities. In my opinion, many of the arguments with activists are arguments of deployment of capital and return over what period of time. Many activists do start with that balance sheet play. As I said before, repurchase shares, increase the dividend. But answer those questions about where you are today and where your company's going before you get asked by that investor from the outside. Be the agitator from the inside. Number 4, executive compensation plan design. Include a component related to progress against long-term goals and objectives in the annual incentive plans for the CEO, C-level executives, and mid-level executives. Some boards argue that disclosing this strategy is disclosing competitive information to competitors. However, in my opinion, in today's world, you need to communicate to investors how you are tying company performance against the long-term goals to CEO suite compensation. And you'd better be able to explain this yourselves to your investors, not by calling in your head of HR or your head of comp for one of those meetings with investors. Number 5, board composition and performance assessment. They suggest that the Nominating and Governance Committee should approach board composition and succession planning with long-term needs in mind based on the skills, the director's skills that will be most relevant to the company's strategy 3 years, 5 years, or more years. The reality is directors need to be active students of the business, seeking out that information from multiple sources in preparation for boardroom discussions rather than being passive recipients of data from management. And rather than being dominated by the retrospective analysis of past performance, the board agendas should provide adequate time for substantive discussion of long-range strategic choices, risks, and opportunities. And last, number 6, engagement and communication with investors. Make clarifying the connection between the company's short-term and medium-term actions, its long-term strategic actions, a primary objective of investor communications. Boards should consider recommending a move away from quarterly earnings guidance in favor of broader guidance parameters tied to long-term performance and strategic objectives. The company's shareholder communications plan should include preparing designated members of the board to engage directly with investors on selected governance matters, including that oversight of the long-term strategy. So those are the 6 items. I'm looking forward to engaging in our discussion and dialogue. And Dan, with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thanks, Ted, and that was very informative. Let me ask you something. Can anyone get on the NACD website and see
Anybody
that?
can access it. You have to be a member to get the copy of the
That's
report.
what I
But you can also, if you're not a member, purchase it for a one-off opportunity.
Or you might ask your best friend who is an NACD member.
Let me make a comment on that if I could. I'd be willing, and you can obtain my email address from the list of attendees this morning, to provide you an electronic copy of the report. So feel free to give me a ring.
See, I told you he was a good friend. So, Mark, how does this issue of long-term performance look from a seat in the trenches of an actual real-life boardroom?
Okay. Thanks, and thanks for everybody for being here. So I thought I'd put my remarks in 3 different categories and 3 different themes. The first one I would give you is actually a little bit of out of Alice in Wonderland. If you remember when Alice is walking down the road and she comes to a fork in the road, that's where she first meets the Cheshire Cat. And she basically says, I don't know which road to take. And the cat says, where do you want to go? And she says, I don't know. And the cat said, then it doesn't matter. And I think is part of what I think I want to address is this whole issue of where do we want to go? And that sounds pretty basic, but I think when I amplify that a bit, you'll get a sense of what I mean. The other thing, and I'd echo what Ted said, is it's great to have a long tail, but you'd better have a short-term strategy around how you're going to perform in the short term. And a lot of companies get mixed up in that. And then the third theme I wanted to touch on is you have to understand the difference between shareholder value and long-term growth. And many times current, short-term shareholder value is at the expense of long-term growth, and that's where activists really do start to attack a company because there's an easy way for them to see how you could improve shareholder value in the short term. And it's in a lot of cases it's because the board isn't clear about what the long term is, and therefore you really are at their mercy. So just starting on that, and kind of back to my Alice in Wonderland comment, and Ted and I were talking about this just before we came up here, is the board has to have an agreement on really very broad strategies. And those strategies, and when I talk about broad strategies, I mean really broad, in the sense of, where are we 5 years from now? Are we a standalone company? Can we grow organically? Should we be looking at acquisition? Should we be looking at being acquired? What you find in a boardroom, and I found it in my boardrooms as well as back when I was in advisor to boardrooms, what you find is there's not always agreement at the board level around those very broad concepts. You'll find board members who absolutely, no matter what, would never agree to sell the company, and then you find board members like me that basically says it's all for sale at any time to anybody. And I think having that dialogue about where you're going to be, where you see yourself, I think is first and foremost the most important thing. Then I think you ultimately have to start to get agreement on time horizons, and what I find is those are very difficult decisions for you and the management team to make. Time horizons, and admittedly, all of my experiences in the tech industry, and I always say 18 months is long term for us. But you do look beyond that. You have to look. My view is you should look 5 years down the road. But 18 months is certainly the near-term strategy that you've got to start to make some progress during that short period of time. I'd also go to the concept of, back on my comments around shareholder value, is what drives shareholder value. And what drives it is expectation and delivery. Just like everything in the world that drives value, it's those two things. What did I expect, and what did the management deliver? And I think, to Ted's point, and this is very hard for a company to do when you're in the public environment, is to hit the reset button and start to reset the street. It's incredibly difficult to do. It does have significant consequences inside the company, and it is a long slog after you've done that to really re-engage with the investor community and get their confidence back. The issue is one of credibility, and once you've lost that with the street, it takes forever to get it back. And I'm sure we've all got experiences we could share in that regard. My final comment on this is the hardest part of a strategy is staying on it. And what I find is management teams tend to they tend to float on you if you're not careful. And this is where the whole concept of governance at the board level comes from. And I'll be candid with you, I find this whole area around long-term growth and strategy to be one of the most difficult areas that there is in the boardroom. Because it is hard for everybody to get their minds around it. It's hard to get everybody to agree with it. A lot of times you don't even find the management team may not be able to articulate what the real strategy of the company is, why we're on that strategy, and what their role is in helping us achieve that strategy. And then that filters obviously up into the board, because if the board is properly configured, it reflects everything that goes on inside the company. It shouldn't be like the company's one thing and the board's another. The board should be the mirror image of what goes on in the company. And so I think the first part there, as I said earlier, is getting everybody to agree on what that strategy is. Nothing that I've found more frustrating in a boardroom is when something happens in the company and then one of the board members says, I was afraid that was going to happen. And I see a lot of people nodding their head that that's happened to them too. And it's like, well, this is a fine time for us to start to talk about that. If you had concerns about this, we should have talked about that a long time ago, and we should have had agreement, because we're all in this together. So I would, and then I said that was going to be my final comment, but my real final comment is, in getting ready for this, I was reminded of an article that Tom Perkins wrote for the Wall Street Journal after the HP blow up, if you remember, a few years ago, where they ran Patricia Dunn out of the company, and I think she actually was charged criminally or something for invasion of privacy. But in that, he wrote an article called The Compliance Board. And he contrasted the difference between a compliance board and a guidance board. The guidance board being more what we're talking about here, which is a board that's able to help craft strategy for management, able to be a sounding board for management, challenge management. And he contrasted that and Tom, of course, was a venture capitalist. And his point was, as a venture capitalist, I was with the company every week. I challenged management every week, and he thought that's what a guidance board would do. And I think that's a fair analysis of the way a board should operate. A lot of people find it unusual, but my own policy is I talk to because I chair the audit committees, I talk to my CFOs in all of my companies every other week, and I talk to the CEO once a month so that I know what's going on and that I'm able to give them input and I'm able to kind of direct real time how we're going to handle certain issues, and so there's very few surprises. So I think and then the compliance board obviously is in the post-Sarbanes-Oxley era where I've got to sit through 5 hours of boredom listening to my auditor tell me stuff that I really don't understand. And I've been an auditor, but I have to tell you, auditing internal controls came way late in my career, and I just don't understand it. But that part of the board is the easy part, because there's a lot of laws that tell you that's what you have to do. The hard part is the strategy part, because there's nothing that says you have to do that. I'm not sure that boards get in trouble because companies don't perform properly. But if you look at what happened in the case of WorldCom, they penalized each one of those directors 20% of their net worth because of failure to adhere to compliance. And in the case of Enron, the board there was personally liable for tens of millions of dollars because, again, lack of paying attention to compliance. I'm not sure that you get in the same kind of trouble for not paying attention to strategy. It's certainly harder to prove that you weren't really paying attention. So.
Excellent, Mark, thanks. It looks just the way I thought it might look from the trenches of the boardroom. Tracy, how does this whole issue look from sort of a scholarly, academic perspective? What can you add to what these two gentlemen provided us?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here with all the leaders and some of the best minds in the corporate governance area. And thanks to Dan to organizing the event and for the invitation. The two speakers, they brought very, very good and interesting points, and I think those are very thought-provoking speech. So from my point of view, actually from the academic world, I would like to share some of the recent empirical research in the area. So just as Ted and Mark mentioned, we want to focus on the long-term view. However, the executives and the board also face some pressure from Wall Street, from financial analysts in terms of pushing for the short-term goals. So in the academic world, we are shifting our research focus from looking at the tension between management and board into whether it is possible to achieve both the long-term goal and short-term goal. So we have an old proverb saying that if you want to catch two rabbits at the same time, you might not catch either of them. But is it possible here that we can reach both the long-term goals and at the same time we'll have reach some short-term goals at the same time? So I want to share some views from the academic research and empirical findings, whether it is possible. So first of all, just as Ted says that it is very important to set a clear objective, and it is true. It is very important for the board and the management to set a very clear objective. But at the same time, I think in the objective, it might be better to have a balanced scorecard where you have both the short-term, say quarterly financial returns in the scorecard, at the same time have the long-term goals, for example, research and R&D expenditure. So have both short-term and long-term goals in the same balanced scorecard as a clear objective. That might be something will help. Okay. And then the second of all, Ted mentioned that it's important to have participation of the board. And we find that it is very important to have an engagement of the full boards. Okay, and then also because every board members, they have different expertise. So it is very important to have a full engagement of all the board members, especially when the company is setting their strategic goals and plans going forward. And then at the same time, as I think you all know that with the changing and challenging environment that companies face going forward, the board role becomes more demanding and challenging. So I think it is important for the company to provide the resources to the board members to grow the expertise and to have experience to meet those more demanding challenges going forward. And one thing we find that, especially for long-term goals, is it possible to set or change the compensation structure. So first of all, it might be important to increase the compensation for board members, but at the same time, more importantly, is it possible to change the structure of compensation? Can we include long-term goals in the board member compensation? For example, include some option compensation, or include some incentive compensation where the board members only get compensated after they leave the board member, a few years after they leave the board position. So is it possible to include such long-term incentive compensation in the compensation package for the board member to create a long-term incentive going forward? And then the third one, just as Mark said that we should have a full agreement among all the board members, and I think that's very important, especially, as Mark said, for the strategy planning and set for the long-term goal. The full agreement among board members is very important, and that does require the full engagement of the board members and their participation. And then also Ted mentioned about communication. I think shareholder activism has increased so much. One survey shows that from 2010 to 2014, there is 88% increase in shareholder activism events. So that's a large increase. So how a board member can facing or can deal with the shareholder activism. And I think, as Ted mentioned, communication is very, very important. And a proactive engagement of the shareholders, especially large shareholders, are very important. And also, as Ted mentioned, we have different type of shareholders. And Ann Simpson, the director of corporate governance in CalPERS, and she mentioned that there are three types of shareholders. We have owners, we have traders, and we have raters. So how do you deal with different type of shareholders? That's also very important there. And the CEO of BlackRock, he mentioned that it is very important for the board to have a robust and ongoing communication with the large shareholders, key shareholders, in the company. And also, a trend that we observe is that right now the companies, they are increasing disclosure and transparency in the company, where they actually disclose how they engage large and key shareholders with the company in a proxy statement. And the shareholders, they actually like that. They encourage companies to disclose how they engage with the large shareholders. So I think, that would be my main points there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Tracy. Let me ask a fairly simple, maybe simple-minded question of the panel before we turn it over to the audience here. And I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said something like, we plan for the long run, but we eat in the short run. So what is the magic of long-run goals and long-run performance?
It's like running.
What's the benefit?
For me, it's like running a marathon. You've got to run 1 mile first before you can run 26.2. And so, in working with a management team, if you've got clarity around that 5-year strategy, that 5-year strategy has to be broken into pieces. You can't get from where you are today to where you want to be in 5 years. And back to Tracy's comment on that balanced scorecard, yes, there have got to be some short-term goals around meeting your quarterly earnings and those sorts of things. But you've also, at the same time, in your compensation plans, in your reviews with your management team, got to break it into smaller pieces and hold them accountable for those smaller pieces along the way.
Mark, any observations?
Yeah, I think it starts with, for any company, I think, first of all, I think you have to look at your total addressable market, right? You've got to look at what your TAM is, where you are in that market versus your competitors. And then you've got to decide, well, what piece of that is strategic for me? What do I have to achieve? And then I think you set that as a goal. And then I think to the point Ted made is, and Tracy, and I think we all know this, but it's incredibly hard to do, which is the short-term goals need to build to what that long-term objective is. And so once you start to set the street's expectations that we're growing at, one of my companies is growing at a little over 100% a year. Well, our investors expect that. Now, I keep reminding everybody, the one thing that businesses get in trouble in, they forget that the exponential rate works against you. So it's, 100 million, when you're a 100 million company and you grow to 200 million, that's one thing. When you're a $1 billion company trying to go to 2 billion, that's quite a different thing. So, but I think it's a matter of ultimately setting a stake in the ground and then figuring out what those short-term objectives are that get you there. Some of that is publicly made. You do it publicly. You set your own expectations, give your own guidance, and a lot of it is private, where the board just decides, well, this is what we've got to do in R&D, this is what we've got to do around people, this is when we're going to have to replace the CEO, all of those kinds of things. But I come back to, and I don't know that this is the right way to look at it, but it's the way I look at it. I have one objective, I have one purpose in the company, and that's to enhance shareholder value. And I've got to figure out a way to do that in the long run, in the short term and the long run.
Tracy, any comment on this point?
Yeah, I agree both what Ted and Mark said. And I think achieving long-term value creation and also the short-term goals are a inevitable tension all the time for the company. And I think it's very important to set goals for both. But I think more important is that because of the pressure from Wall Street and the market, it is very important to communicate your long-term goals, especially with the key shareholders. So when you set your long-term goal, let them know, and then communicate very effectively and transparently with them what are the long-term goals and what is the key metrics and what are the key strategies that you want to achieve that. So I think that might make it easier for you to go through all these ways to achieve probably both.
One of the things that came to my mind when you were talking about that is, and this comes from your part of the market in Silicon Valley, this idea of pivots, where a company starts off on one strategy, whoops, that's not working, so they pivot, and they do that for a while, and they pivot again. So it seems like they're building a company that's just a series of short terms. Do you know any companies that have been successful over the long run by having a series of fairly different and not necessarily connected short runs? I spent my career in retail business, so that's sort of like the way the fashion business runs, Sure.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I'm trying to think of how much of this I can talk about, but I'll use my company Lattice Semiconductor as an example. So we're an FPGA company, and we have two very large competitors, Xilinx and Altera, one of which has been bought by Intel. So now we've got a giant and a huge competitor, and we're kind of the smaller player in the market. For a long time, our strategy was, well, we basically are there as a third supplier to make sure we're there to keep everybody honest. And as I've always said, you can make a nice business out of doing things other people don't want to do. So it was a nice business, been going along. But we decided that we needed a breakout strategy, so we ultimately started to develop technologies around very low power, low form factor FPGAs, and then we just determined that, and then Samsung approached us back when they were doing the S4 and said they had a problem with it. They'd already gone to ASIC and asked if we could do an FPGA to solve their problem. And we did, and we found out that, well, there was a huge market in mobility for low power, low form factor FPGAs. So the company's strategy changed to that, to become the leader in that whole area. That led us to solutions around connectivity, because those are the next big things. So that strategy evolved out of the fact that we were in a market where we really were not going to go anywhere other than where we'd been. So it was either sell the company or move to new markets. Hard to do, took us years to do it. It was a lot of angst among a lot of shareholders, but I think they've ultimately gotten themselves comfortable with it. So that's an example, I think, of it. But I would also say, in my experience in companies and the way I try to manage that from a board level, is I don't let the decks change quarter to quarter. It's like, you showed me that slide last quarter, I want to see that same slide this month. Because strategy drift is the way I would put it, more than a pivot, because it's the drift of a strategy that'll kill you more than a pivot. A pivot, everybody on the board will talk about, you'll be aware of that. The strategy drift, you won't know unless you're paying attention to it. And the only way to do that is keep the information flow to you consistent, so you can see how it tracks over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, as the world has accelerated, people mistake the pivot for that change in strategy. And the reality is if a business isn't reinventing itself, you may have a plan for where you want to go 5 years from now, but if you don't in year 2, take stock of where we are today and where we want to go now, 5 more years from there, and evaluate whether we're in the right place, you don't have an agile organization that's responding to the market and to your customers.
Sure. Okay, it's your turn now. I would like to turn this into a dialogue, a discussion, conversation. So we'll take questions or comments from you all, address them to either the panel generally or anybody in particular. Please, when you're ready, put your hand up and wait for Ashley to bring you a microphone. And then I'll help by kind of repeating the question, mostly to give these people a chance to figure out what they're going to say in response. Okay. Yes. Bill.
So if we can continue that conversation just a moment.
Bill, wait for Ashley to bring you the. You weren't listening.
Bill's always the first question, for those of you that.
Well, that was embarrassing. At least I have a mic to drop now. So if we could continue along that line of conversation that we were just having, and elevate the conversation to Apple, and think about where Apple is right now. And if you were advising Tim Cook and his board, here they are with no new products in sight. Here they are with a lot of cash. Here they are with the opportunity to build a car. Here they are with the opportunity to build more content, to own content. Here they are with an opportunity to be another syndicated element on the TV and other devices. And in the meantime, they have to continue to satisfy Wall Street. Where are they right now in your mind? What advice are you giving them? What thoughts are you, without knowing much more than you know relative to public information about Apple? But it's a large macrocosm of the conversation about pivot on strategy, strategy drift, about where they ought to be going.
Let me repeat that. And the reason I'm doing this is because we have to use 2 different sound systems here. So this one goes into the video feed. So Bill asked about if you were occupying an independent director seat on Apple, and you see Apple seem to be running out of new products, running out of innovations, running out of creative activities to drive that long term. What would you advise them to do to maintain both that short-term performance and continue to achieve those long-term goals? Fair enough?
Well, some of it they're already doing. You know, they just announced they're raising $30 billion offshore because they can't bring money back to the United States because of the tax laws. So they're raising $30 billion offshore to bring back to actually do a share buyback. So they're kind of improving shareholder value just by doing these buybacks now. So that's what they're trying to do in the short term. Long term, you know, I mean, Tim Cook doesn't ask me what I think, but I'll tell you what I think. You know, there really is only one smartphone in the world anymore. If you have to be, I mean, we all have to be serious about that. I mean, Samsung has come and gone, and they've really hit the wall. So there's really only Apple kind of left. There's a lot of Chinese companies, but they're really not smartphones. They're very low-end kind of things. So they are dominant in a market, and being dominant in a market, you know, creates tons of opportunity for a company, because that channel, the real value that Apple has is its brand and the channel that it's in. The rest of it's just product. So they're working on some things. They're trying to make laptops go away. Ultimately, they're working on, my advice would be, work on how to make a smartphone go away. And they're doing that with the watch. They're starting with the watch, but they're, you know, if you think about Google Glass and some of the other things that they're working on now, they really do have a very unique opportunity. And then I don't know if you saw it the other day, but Tesla is basically now saying they think their competitor is going to be an iCar. You know, why is Google playing around with self-driving cars? Well, because those are new markets that they feel they can play in. So I think you'll see them in a lot of, we're just at the, you know, I always like to say, if you think about the technology industry as a nuclear explosion, you're a nanosecond away from the explosion. What's coming at us is incredible. Even though what we've already seen is incredible, it's only begun. So that'd be my view of it. I think they have tons of opportunity ahead of them.
Yeah. And frankly, I agree with that. If I were a director there, what I'd be looking after most closely is talent. Who's got the capacity to succeed Tim Cook? I mean, we recruited him years ago to that company, you know, and he was in that #2 job for a very long time. But you look at these large enterprises, whether it's Disney, whether it's Apple, whether it's General Motors, whether it's IBM, who has the capacity to lead an enterprise that large? And who has the leadership talent and skill set to marshal the right people to come forward to get to the right strategy? Apple's in the fortunate position that they've got the access to capital. They've got the established dominant place to be. Now it's a question of how do you not break it and continue to have that trajectory going forward?
Yeah, I agree with them both. I think, just as Ted said, Apple has some of the smartest talent, smartest people there. I think at the same time, I think they probably to emphasize, know what you are good at, or best at. Know your skill set. So what are the things that you would do best? And then maybe strive for that. So is it, do you have the skill set and all the knowledge to be good at producing cars or the other things? But know your skill set, know what you are best at, and then go from there. And I think in terms of short term, as Apple has cash, okay. So I think in there they would be able to meet their short-term goals. But in the long term, I think that's where they want to think more about.
Anybody else want to comment? Yes, please. Let's wait for the microphone, please.
Sure. My question is, we concentrate so much on the big cap companies where there are activists out there. What about some of the smaller cap companies like Russell 2000 or the 1 to 3 billion market cap, where most of the shares are held by mutual funds and different managers that have the portfolio, along with a couple hundred other firms. They're not really looking at the management strategy per se. You just don't have the time to do that. Therefore, the numbers become very important. In terms of the management team, where do you draw the line? very recently, we've seen the financial engineering, the buybacks, the dividend increases, giving that up for R&D, for M&A, and kind of using, that cash where it does not bring a lot of value long term. So what is the advice to some companies like that?
So you're going to have, you may have to help me out on this. We've been talking about large companies like Apple, and there's a much larger group of companies, mid-cap companies, who don't have the kind of resources and flexibility of capital-rich and talent-rich companies who have to make trade-offs between the long run and the short run in terms of resource allocation. How do they make that delicate balance?
Yeah. I'd love to jump in on it, because to me this is one of the biggest threats to American competitive advantage that exists out there today. So if you're a $500 million company and you're publicly traded and you're chugging along and doing, let's just presume everything's going just fine, but you hit a blip, you hit a quarter or two where things hit a bump, you're not going to end up with Nelson Peltz showing up on your doorstep. You're not going to end up with Bill Ackman. You're going to end up with some Yahoo who raised $20 million and levered it up 5-to-1, who comes in and buys into your stock and decides to scream bloody murder and either ask for the CEO's head or run a proxy contest or whatever the case may be. And you don't have Wachtell on speed dial. You're not going to get Goldman's best bankers to show up to help you with your defense. And you're really left at the mercy of this battle in the public markets going on today. And I think it's a huge problem, because if you look at their behavior, what they often do is see a disconnect where a company has underperformed for some period of time. And if you really pay attention, they show up after management's already done an investor presentation on how they're going to get back on track, and they bring attention to it. And by screaming bloody murder, the stock takes a bump, and 18 months later they declare victory for something that they had nothing to do with. And they've taken advantage of other investors in that situation. And in my opinion, it's a real problem. And it's a reason why Byron Trott and BDT Capital have had such success of keeping companies private. There are lots of families who want to be those owners who are that long-term patient capital. And if I were running a company today, I'd want to stay private as long as possible, and I'd be looking for access to that patient long-term capital to try and build a truly sustainable enterprise. But once you, back to Mark's comments, once you've gone public, you're for sale every day, share by share. And that's the reality of the market and the reality of the choices that you've made. It's a reason that private equity, if you look at it over time, has been so successful, because you take management incentives and owner incentives and you align them over a specific time period. Everybody knows that over 3 to 5 years, we want to maximize the asset and have a sale. And everything's aligned in that case. You don't have a situation where you might have a CEO who's thinking 10 years, a board who's thinking 50 years, and a trader who's thinking 50 seconds, and the cacophony that comes together when those countervailing opinions come together.
Well, welcome to my world. I mean, this is the world I live in. And I'd give you a couple of examples. I actually was on the board of a company called OpenWave, which then became Unwired Planet, and completely reconfigured the business, and we reconfigured the business. I was actually brought in by Starboard Value to help them figure out the investment thesis in the company, and they already knew where they wanted to take the company. So in that case, it was a very troubled company where there was a new strategy that was put in place by an activist who came in. And if you know Starboard, they're doing the Yahoo thing, and they did Darden. They did Darden restaurants. They did Tessera. They've done and are doing a lot of different activists. And they're actually pretty good at what they do. They basically, on top of them, we had another activist come in. And then Starboard got out, and then a third activist came in. And so I started to feel like an abused child because it was just like every day it was something, somebody had a new idea. And I would tell you, in the public world today, every company has an activist in it, at least in my industry. They're not necessarily public, but don't kid yourself. They send letters, they send presentations. A lot of it's really good stuff. And a lot of times we do engage with them. My point to our management teams is about the only place I can think this works is on their spreadsheet. I don't think it works in the real world like this, but you got to go talk to them. But this is where the board has to be united. An activist shareholder doesn't control the company. They're only a shareholder. And they can't, in a proxy fight, which is the big thing you've got to be careful of, if you've got the rest of the people that you talked about that aren't involved in the company, if you keep them involved in the company and you are delivering on those short-term objectives, they're not going to win a proxy fight, and the board can be very careful, can be very comfortable they're not going to. And you can then execute on the long term. But you have to be, I think you have to assume, even if you don't know there's an activist in the company, you have to assume there will be at some point. And it's hard. It takes you months to figure out who's been buying your stock, and a lot of times you don't know about it until they file their forms. But
I think for medium and small size companies, maybe it will be good for the board to be very proactive with their shareholders. So talk to shareholders before the problem arises. Okay, and also not only the large shareholders, but maybe it's possible to have a shareholder meeting. So for example, Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway, they have the shareholder meeting, annual shareholder meeting with over 30,000 shareholders. But it is a way to being proactive with shareholders, before anything major comes up.
I think I'll just echo one thing. I think nothing makes your comment about communicating with shareholders, nothing makes a CEO of a company crazier than thinking that their board members are actually talking to shareholders. And so I think it's important that the board have a strategy around shareholder communication. I do think it should go beyond the CEO, but probably not much further than chairman of the board. That's just a word of warning to everybody.
Let me ask a favor of whoever wants to make a comment or question. Introduce yourself to the rest of the crowd so we kind of know who you are and what your connection is. We're going to do Kathy first here.
Kathy Cunningham, I'm chair of the audit committee at RE/MAX. I have to disagree with you, Tracy. I've been on 9 boards, and to ask boards to have direct contact with the activist shareholder, I think is incredibly naive and risky, partly because of financial disclosure requirements and partly because the board is never as close to what's going on in the company as the investor relations people, the CEO and so forth. So I just want to echo Mark's comment that it's the chair at best, the chair and the CEO, but I think it's incredibly dangerous to get it. And first of all, we have a lot to do. The number of hours, I think the average at NACD would say is 248 hours. It may be double that for those of us that haven't kept track, but to add that to the responsibility of a director, I just think it's dangerous and it's naive. That's just my personal comment.
Kathy, though, I've had instances in one of my companies where we've had an activist, they haven't gone public yet, but they've actually asked to sit down with the entire board. I don't know if any of you have had that happen. And we've refused that because it's like, well, what are you going to tell us? And what do you want to hear from us? And so it would basically, our comment is it's a waste of an hour because I can read what you're going to tell me, and I'm not going to tell you anything. So
Ted, what was the position that the Blue Ribbon Commission took on this communication with major shareholders?
Well, I'll get separate from communication with activists to major shareholders, right? Okay. So which is, if it's Vanguard or BlackRock, they've got a process, they've got people who vote the proxies for them, and both with your IR group. But if there's an issue that comes up, if you've got a say on pay vote that you're struggling with, then you're going to have the head of your comp committee out and talking to your largest shareholders if ISS has recommended something the other direction. I mean, I think this is one of the problems with boards today, is instead of doing what's right for the company, some boards have started running for election. And just because ISS has a rule that says they're going to recommend a no vote doesn't mean that that's not still the right thing for a board to do. It just means that you've got more work to do to get out and talk to your shareholders. to make that happen. And in that limited case, I think the board does have to engage on behalf of the company, obviously in cooperation with management, in a coordinated way about that. I think the BRC's mindset on dealing with activists is, whether it's management or whether it's the board, it's the don't just put out the stiff arm, but be willing to listen, be willing to engage, be willing to hear the ideas. Because the reality is if they show up and they're a 6, 7, 8% shareholder, they've got a lot to say when it comes time to do elections if they're unhappy with what's going on. And so there's an opportunity for constructive engagement rather than stonewalling someone along the way. Where I start to have trouble is where somebody, owns 1 or 2% and starts demanding 3 or 4 board seats, and a board, in trying to get away from a proxy fight, just capitulates and gives a minority shareholder disproportionate influence over what happens with the company. And next thing you know, you see these dividend recaps or cuts in R&D spending or other things to do a temporary pop in the share price, as opposed to what is a longer-term investment in the enterprise.
Tracy, any response?
Yeah, I think I want to. Yeah, I want to add is that what I want to say is find a way, or maybe effective, efficient way that you can communicate to the shareholders. Not necessarily a board needs to do that, but find an efficient way to do that before the problem arises, especially with activists. I think you will wait until those large key shareholders knock at the door saying that we want to do something. Instead of having that, it's much better to prepare beforehand. That's what I want to say.
And I think to Ted's point, I would just say it is a trend now that the larger investors want to talk to the comp committee. I don't know if that's good or bad, and a lot of the people on comp committee are saying, I'm getting off of this thing if that's going to happen. But they do want to have influence because they do view executive compensation being a way that they can really start to steer the company a bit. And then you're starting to see the SEC new rules on audit committee disclosures, which are basically going to be really enhance what audit committees are doing and talking about. So there's a lot of push in a lot of different forms now for increased disclosures on what the board is doing. So,
Hugh had a comment or a question back here, Ashley, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. My name is Hugh Rice. I'm with FMI Corporation, and my experience has been virtually 100%, with one exception in the 90s, privately owned companies, sitting on boards of privately owned companies, either family-owned or employee-owned. And there's lots of things that we've talked about here that sort of come together. Some things are clearly in the realm of the board, CEO selection, compensation systems, those kinds of things. Where we struggle sometimes with companies that I'm involved with is strategy. There's this thing about what management does and what the board does, and how those things sometimes overlap and sometimes conflict. When you talk about strategy and long-term direction of the firm, is that the board's responsibility? Where does management come into that? Because I have some experiences where the management says, look, we're doing that. We take care of that. We'll put it in front of you and let you approve or not approve, but we develop it. And I'm curious as to what this board thinks about how active we as board members should be in developing long-term strategy.
Let me paraphrase that a bit. Hugh has a lot of experience on boards of private companies and some with public companies. He's interested in where the responsibility for developing and instituting strategy lies between the board and management. And I suspect for private companies that gets even more complicated because there's probably bloodlines involved in there. So,
Yeah.
So what do you think?
But there's no better way to get fired as a manager than to develop a strategy, plop it on the front of the board, and have the strategy go wrong. Whereas if it's a co-owned process and we all go in and exercise our business judgment, I think the board recognizes that they were participants as well, and that the strategy we chose just didn't work, and so we can pivot. I think the BRC Commission really believes that the responsibility for strategy is a shared responsibility between management and the board. If you turn it into that approval, to me, you're turning back the clock, 10, 15 years for the way that managers, at least in public companies, operated. I think you do have the challenge in a private enterprise is, in any other, you just have a much more direct connection with your owners. And if your owners is a family company that includes 6 cousins who aren't involved in the business, who are used to collecting coupons and dividends, and the company strategy pivots and that's going to bring an end to that, then you're going to have a fight between the board, the management, and your owners in that case. That's the one challenge that I've seen in some family businesses. But I really believe that has to be a shared responsibility, not just in terms of the board approving it, but the board's input in helping to develop it.
So I'll give you an example I'll use Forescout as an example of that. So we're privately held, venture-backed. We're one of the unicorns, so it's $1 billion valued company now. It wasn't when I joined the board 4 years ago. In the first couple of board meetings, because you're sitting there with the owners of the company effectively, and I just was kind of quiet and kind of doing my thing and listening. And finally, the chairman of the board pulled me aside and he said, Mark, if we didn't care what you thought, we wouldn't have asked you to join the board. So we need you to speak up, which is contrast to my other boards where they tell me to shut up most of the time. But I think once you kind of overcome that hurdle, then you start to deal with it more as, hey, I'm here to bring value to everybody in this room. Now, as Forescout's evolved over the last couple of years, we now have the CEO from FireEye on the board. We have the former CEO at Symantec on the board. We have our new CEO is the former CEO at McAfee. There's not much oxygen left in the room when you have that many people sitting around there, but they're able to debate strategy in the boardroom and really help shape the strategy of the CEO. On the other hand, I would tell you, your question was about formulating strategy. I think if the board's involved in formulating the strategy, you probably have the wrong CEO. They've got to execute it, and they're the ones that have to execute it, so they better be the ones that created it and believe in it. But I think the board needs to challenge and really question why we're doing certain things. Do we have first things first? Is the way I always put it. So the first things first is, do we have the right products? Do we have the right quality in our products? Do we have the right customers? Those are kind of some basic things. And then I guess I'd summarize it by saying I think boards get confused and management gets confused a lot of time, the difference between strategy and tactics. And tactics are short-term things that you need to do right now to improve the company. Strategy is this is where I want to be way out into the future, and this is how you get there. So I would just caution board members to, number one, make sure, and then I think ultimately, if you agree with it, then say you agree with it. If you don't agree with it, say you don't agree with it, and work it until finally everybody gets agreement around it. And then from the governance perspective, is make sure everybody stays on it. We were talking earlier, and Ted, maybe you can talk about, we were talking about the process of recruiting board members or recruiting CEOs, and I was telling Ted, my perspective of the reason I like search firms is they kind of hold a mirror up to the company and say, well, tell us who you are. So maybe you could. Yeah,
at the outset when we start an engagement, we do one-on-one interviews with all of the board members, and we just ask them very quickly in 10 minutes to articulate the strategy. And I'm lucky if I get 3 versions out of 10 people. And this comes alive in all different ways with boards. I mean, I think to Mark's point is people don't speak up enough in a group when they disagree with something. So we were working with a mid-sized bank in the Midwest, about $50 billion in assets, so small by financial services standards. We said, do you have an emergency succession plan? And they said, absolutely. And I said, so if the CEO gets hit by a bus, who's going to be the replacement? Is it going to be an interim? And we went through the entire board, and they all knew that they didn't have a CEO in waiting. They all knew that they were going to name a board member as the interim CEO and hire a search firm to go do a search. And there were 3 different names that were given to me through 10 board members. So, go through the exercise. One of our clients got written up in the Wall Street Journal about 8 years ago, they held a mock board meeting that the proverbial plane had gone down, and what were the steps that the company was going to go through? Who was going to communicate with whom? How was the family going to be notified? Who was going to take care of filing the 8K? Should we maybe draft the 8K without knowing exactly what happened about an executive absence event? Who's going to specifically step in? How do we document that and have the binder, on the shelf so that you know what to do? And I think, whether that's the activist calling, whether that's CEO succession planning, whether it's a crisis with your product and a liability issue, there are these scenarios through your risk planning that you can start to think about in advance to get ahead of the game so that you're not caught flat-footed. Because if one of those other elements happens and your stock takes a tank, then you're going to have somebody showing up opportunistically, either a competitor or an investor, looking to take advantage of you.
Anything to add, Tracy?
I'm thinking maybe build and encourage a culture for independent thinking in the boardroom. So just as Mark said, that different company, their board probably have a different culture. So encourage each board member to have their independent and critique thinking in terms of strategic planning. That might be something.
Let me change hats very, very quickly and provide an experience I had during the decade I was an active director, because we had the same situation. The founder of the company was a non-executive chairman and had really a dominating influence on a lot of things. And finally, the board itself had to take a good part of a meeting and have a discussion of who's going to do what in this situation where we have some independent directors, we have a chairman who's not an officer, and we have management. And so strategy has kind of gotten dispersed around. So we just had the explicit conversation about how are we going to do this. And it was very, very helpful. And that encouraged us to have a similar explicit conversation about how we're going to do a lot of other things as a board, because we had never actually done that. So.
And I might extrapolate, because I think when Mark and I talk to you, it might take my mindset where it's a shared responsibility and his mindset there. I think it is still a shared responsibility. The board can't create the strategy, but your management team needs to bring that strategy not fully baked, but engage in a dialogue with the board around it to frankly get the best thinking. I mean, if you think of the talent that's sitting around a boardroom table, you couldn't afford those people as consultants to the company. So let's pull out and get their experience while we're developing it, not have a 30-page presentation that we're going to go to an up or down vote back and forth.
Thanks for the question, Hugh. Robbie had a question or a comment over here.
Okay, thanks. Hi, I'm Robbie Gilmore. I'm independent director of several corporations. And I'm just curious the panel's thoughts around ISS. It seems to me that many of my friends might label them as the corporate ISIS, but there's really an abdication by shareholders, in my view, of much of their understanding of company and how companies are run, particularly in administrative areas. But even so, we really are going towards a rules-based governance, and I think we're losing judgment and boardroom judgment. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that trend.
So the question is, what does the panel think about ISS, Institutional Shareholder Services, who advise institutional shareholders on a number of things, including how to vote on proxies, and they do this through a series of guidelines and standards that they have set for themselves. And so the question is, are we moving toward a situation of rules-based governance, or does judgment still count? I added that myself, Robbie. I hope you don't mind.
I like that answer.
I'll kind of kick it off. ISS and Glass Lewis have lost a lot of influence over the last couple of years because of some of the new SEC rules that have come out. They don't require institutional shareholders now to vote on everything. And because of that, they've lost a lot of their influence, because it used to be that they just would trigger automatic voting because they were authorized to vote the shares in certain matters without really coming back to the shareholder. Having said that, I think where they do have a lot of influence is when they set their guidelines at the outset. So guidelines around management compensation, guidelines around tenure around boards, guidelines around independence of boards, the number of boards people can be on, things like that. I think you set the parameters for the company of, if you're going to be outside those boundaries, you'd better have a communication plan with your shareholders why you're going to be outside those bounds. And what I found, and I have one of my companies, we are out of bounds on a couple of things, but we've had very good communication with our large shareholders, why we've done that, why it's in their best interest, and they've accepted that. And you get a certain amount of withholds, but we've also been able to get everything passed. Having said that, I had another company where there was a recommended no vote on our incentive plan, and we failed in that. So they go both ways. I think they are useful if you really understand what those rules are and you understand if you're out of bounds. My personal view is they're just a pain to deal with. And I think to Ted's point earlier, they can get you confused really easily. If you give them too much influence. It's kind of my comment around activists too. I think the one thing a board member can do when you have these kinds of things going on is remind management, to the point Ted made, they're only a small shareholder. You're spending way too much time on a 2% shareholder. And we got other things to worry about.
Any other comments on ISS?
If I look back, it was that disconnect between your shareholders and these voting rights. And the reality is the people who do the proxy voting are down in the basement of these massive financial institutions, and the asset managers who are deciding to buy or sell a company are completely disconnected from the voting, and so they abdicated it to ISS. I think the large shareholders are getting better, Vanguard, BlackRock, they've got these processes in place, but you look at one of the most active players in the corporate governance arena, CalPERS, and they're still an index fund. So they'll scream bloody murder about your corporate governance, but they won't sell your shares. So until an investor is willing to walk away because of these issues, a prime example, I'm still appalled that anybody owns Facebook. For God's sake, Mark Zuckerberg can appoint his successor from the grave. He went out and bought a $6 billion company without consulting his board. Why would anybody ever buy a share of stock in that? So if you don't have some viewpoint as an investor that you want to be able to have influence, then voting doesn't really matter at all.
Yeah, we have some recent research papers, and they look at whether the advisory firms, such as ISS, they actually add value or create value to the firm. But however, the empirical evidence show that there is no value addition. So as you said, that they mainly they are rule-based. So they go for each vote, they actually go just for the best practices. However, those rule-based or best practices may not fit your company. A different company, different individual company, they have different situations. So we find that those rule-based practices are not creating value. And then another observation is that, for example, CalPERS, they start to have their own internal governance team. So they will cast their own vote. So they know much better about those companies. So it's better for them to have their internal governance team there.
Any other comments, observations about ISS or any of the advisory firms? All right, we'll just let the elephant walk out of the room. Bill has a comment or a question.
Let me take the conversation to ethics, if I could. And if we could think about the intersection between balancing short-term against long-term value. We know we have good examples about short-term missteps in ethics. We have some examples about missteps in long-term value creation in terms of ethics. think out loud for us. What are some of the issues? What are going to be some of the issues relative to ethical decisions, good ethical decisions, in terms of creating long-term value?
So the question has to do with the role of or the impact on a company's standards of ethics, standards of behavior, standards of integrity in balancing long-run performance and short-run performance. We know there's missteps in value creation on both sides. So the question is, how does a company, and I'm going to extend this to how do individual independent directors on a board anticipate these kinds of challenges and deal with them?
Well, I mean, to me, I come to culture, because there isn't a risk management committee, an internal audit control, or anything else. If two people in your company want to steal from you, they can steal from you. And the reality is senior executives get paid a lot of money to operate in the gray zone. You know, it's not black or it's not white. But you do have a culture and an appetite for risk that is apparent to people in the company and outside the company around what is right and what is wrong and what's accepted. I mean, I think anybody who interacted with Enron knew that they were always at the edge and pushing the envelope as best they could in everything that they did to try and, you know, maximize their returns. And sooner or later that came back and hurt them. I did some work a few years ago with the CEO of a very large financial services firm that had grown through acquisition through the years. And they had 52 accounting systems that they ran. And I said to the CEO, how in the world can you sign the annual report or the 10Q and go to bed at night? And we were walking down the hallway at their headquarters, and there was an office that didn't have a light on. And he walked in and he flipped the light on, and he pointed to a little rock sitting on the desk. And I started to realize these are on every desk. And the prior CEO, the founder, had done this. And the rock was engraved and it said, "No chalk on the shoes." The company's culture was never get close enough to the line that you get chalk on your shoes, back to the football analogy. And if you've got a culture like that, and those ethics pervade throughout the company from top to bottom, which is we're going to do the right thing, whether it means we miss our short-term goals or whether it's in an interaction with a customer. If you've got that kind of culture, then I think the board, the CEO, everybody can sleep well at night. Now, how do you support that kind of culture as a director? Well, you've got to be willing to say, hey, we're not going to make our numbers this time and take your lumps in the market, and hold management accountable for how we're going to get back or what went wrong along the way. But if what went wrong was a mistake with a customer or a mistake somewhere else along the way, don't rob from Peter to pay Paul just to make the quarterly numbers. But a board needs to stand up with management and take those lumps in the market just like any other success or failure along the way. And I think where those things go wrong is where a manager or a board doesn't say, bring your problems to me so that we can work on those and figure them out together, that they get hidden down below, and you have a culture of fear and people stuff those things back on the other side, and then you start to see an environment and a culture where people behave in contrary to what their own personal ethics may be along the way because of their fears about keeping their job or something else along the way.
You know, the first rule of growth is don't shrink, and the first rule of building shareholder value is don't destroy any. And what you find in ethics breaches is you destroy shareholder value in a heartbeat, and it takes forever to get it back. And I think that boards need to have need to basically ingrain that in their own mind and ingrain it in the minds of management. Is if we have a credibility problem in this company, it will be gone forever, and our future is out of our control. You know, I spent 35 years in the audit business, and I used to tell everybody I felt like I was Jiminy Cricket sitting on, the shoulder of the CEOs, basically saying, you probably shouldn't do that. I can tell you that's an easier role than being on the board. When you're looking at these kinds of decisions, it's much more nuanced than people think it is. There are a lot of things are obviously black and white. There are other things that, how are we going to communicate this particular strategy to our shareholders? How are we going to, how are you going to deal with the press release? How are you going to deal with certain employees when they have certain breaches? I give you an example from 10 years ago. Was working with a company that one of their top executives had done something that wasn't in and of itself illegal. It would have been fine, except that for whatever reason, he decided he wanted to cover up what he had done. So the original problem, if he would have just said, yeah, I did that and I shouldn't have done that, he would have been fine. The cover-up basically got him fired. CEO basically said, you know what, I don't have people that lie to me, so you're out of here. And he was an incredibly valued part of the management team. I thought that was one of the bravest moves I'd seen anybody make, because it did set the company back a bit while they tried to replace that person. But I think to Ted's point, it's culture, number one, but I think it's also a realization that that's ethics are a one-way street, in my view, and once it's gone, it's gone forever.
Yeah, I agree. I think building culture is the most important thing. How to create an environment that people think that the ethics is very important, is the most important. I think that's the key.
Let me once again take my moderator hat off for a couple of seconds. Some of you I've had this conversation with both individually and as a group, that having a discussion at a board meeting among board members on ethics and ethical standards is a very tough thing to do. And I'm relating back to the 10 years I spent on corporate boards. I don't think the boards I were on ever had that conversation, so we really didn't know how our fellow directors viewed this issue of integrity and responsibility and ethical standards and so on. Now, since my director career has ended, I think there's an advantage now because of this enterprise risk assessment tool and mandate to have the discussion at the board level on what is our appetite for risks of all kinds. I think probably opens an opportunity for an independent director with some backbone to begin the conversation about reputational risk. And that opens up a whole variety of other topics that get into the issues of integrity and ethics and responsibility, and can then move toward exactly the question you're asking, Bill, in terms of long-run, short-term focus and balance and all those sorts of things. It seems to me. Now, I'm no longer sitting on board, so I don't know that for.
But for me, it really centers around tone at the top. And my question would be, when you hire or select a CEO, what sort of engagement have you had with them around ethics and those demonstrations of behaviors of doing the right thing, of not just doing the right thing when it's easy, but doing the right thing when it's hard. And being a CEO is a very, very lonely place to be. Leading a business is a lonely place to be, whether it's a divisional role along the way. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to be responsible for just the numbers. But if you can't prove or test that people are willing to do the right thing time and time again when forced to, you make that decision when you hire the person, not when you fire them.
Sure. Mark. Patience is good.
Yeah, I'm Bart Alexander, currently a consultant and formerly exec with Molson Coors. We've talked about this in the ethical arena. Could we extend that into the corporate responsibility and sustainability arena? What's the responsibility of the board in listening to other stakeholders beyond shareholders, in looking at the pressures and the changing dynamics of the world around us, and that involves engagement with special interest groups, but it could be broader than that. Just curious how you see that.
So let me repeat this for
you want to go?
Yeah, for my best friend behind the camera here. The issue has to do with not only board responsibilities for culture and ethics, but Bart's bringing up the topic of corporate responsibility and sustainability. What is the board's responsibility in those areas? What is the board's responsibility to formulate engagements with other stakeholders? And how does the board raise those issues to importance?
I think the way I would I address the issue, and we do address it on all of our companies, is, you know, our goal is not to just do good and avoid evil. You know, our goal is to create shareholder value. How do you do that? By attracting the best and the brightest. And when you start trying to recruit millennials today or younger people today, they want to know they work for a company that's that's responsible, that sees the world in its totality, that wants to deal with and do the right thing when you start thinking about the environment and other kind of sustainability issues. So I personally kind of take it out of that realm of, well, we ought to do this because it's the right thing to do, and I put it into the realm of it's really an imperative for the company in terms of who we recruit, how we recruit. Our customers, a lot of times customers are asking for, you know, what are you doing in that regard? Shareholders are asking what you're doing in that regard. So there's a true business imperative there, and if your companies aren't focused on it, they should be.
Ted, any comment?
No, I think that's
Tracy?
well said.
So hi, Brian Shade with Gartner. Work in the Business Advisory Service, currently serve on the board here, as well as a handful of other advisory boards around. A little bit different direction, more around corporate board makeup. In the advisory service I'm a part of, we work with executive teams up through the boards. More often than not, we are seeing gaps in board makeup, mostly due to the increasing pace of technology change, a lot of the security issues. A lot of the board makeup tends to be historic. They've always done things a certain way. And to your guys' points around guidance versus, you know, compliance boards, and I agree wholeheartedly that the board ought to be jointly work with the management team on strategy issues. But in some of the older school boards, we find that to be a more difficult task given some of the pace of change issues. So from your guys' perspective, are you seeing current board makeup starting to shift? Are there best practices you guys have identified out there? Are you guys seeing the same kind of gaps? And what advice would you have to any board today that wants to best position itself from a makeup perspective going forward?
The topic that was brought up is board makeup or board composition. And Brian says he's seeing gaps in boards that he works with, often around rapidly advancing technology and the increasing importance of paying attention to security. Many boards, described as older school boards, are kind of composed as usual and have the same kind of responsibilities and assignments as usual. Even though these issues have changed substantially. So the question is, what do we see as trends? What do you see as trends in terms of board makeup and composition? What are the best practices these days for dealing with board structure or board composition in a rapidly changing environment? What's your advice and counsel?
I mean, I think every board today has their skills matrix and, you know, looks at their diversity issues and, you know, diversity of skill sets sitting around the board. You know, personally, I think one of the more healthy things that is going to be coming down in the next couple of years is more of an emphasis on term limits rather than age limits for boards. That's going to create some more frequent turnover. Because what I would hate for a board to do is recreate the mistakes that we saw in the late 90s, which was everybody was worried about Y2K, everybody ran out and recruited a CIO onto their board, and then Y2K was a big yawn, and then you had somebody taking up a board seat for the next 15 years that really didn't add strategic value to the business. So while I believe that you've got to get specific skill sets, whether that's marketing, operations, manufacturing, your financial expert onto the board. In my observation in 20 years in this business, the best directors are those that have come up through that vertical and moved into the breadth of general management. People who've been CEO of organizations, who've been there, done that, who can provide the advice and counsel to a management team from their breadth of experience, to not just give the answers, but to ask the right questions along the way to lead the management team there. And I think as long as you have a diversity of backgrounds and experiences, you can fill those gaps along the way. But what you find today is, because most boards do not have a term limit, the boards that are starting to say, gee, we feel like we have a flat spot around a digital native or somebody experienced in social media. Well, the most experienced people in social media are 35 years old, and they start looking at that and going, gosh, if we recruit them on the board, they're going to be here for 40 years. Well, I can tell you the candidates certainly don't think that, but there's this mindset that these board seats are that, yes, there are annual elections, but that you get on and you're there for a long period of time. And I think, much healthier relationship is, and I've seen candidates start to say this, where they're saying, I know that based on my age, I might be here for 20 years, but if you bring me onto your board, I think we should think about this in something in the 5 to 10 year category. Let's try it for a couple of years, and then let's have an honest discussion as to whether this is working for you and working for me. And I think that's a much healthier place to be where we are today than where we were. But when you see what's coming from the institutional investors, term limits are coming, whether people want them or not. So you better figure out how you're going to tackle that and how you're going to get there.
Because I thought ISS had come out with their position being
They did.
Instead of term limits, they wanted a more robust self-evaluation of board performance.
They do, and the institutional investors want that as well. But if you talk to CII, the Council of Institutional Investors, and then talk to the large players, State Street, Vanguard, BlackRock, they're all doing screens for their no votes to surface people up for analysis by their proxy voting department based on average tenure. And so GE was the first to come out, or the first large cap to come out. They decided to go with a 15-year term limit. But I think that this idea that these are seats for life is the piece that's causing institutional investors to push back, because they're hearing boards say that we've got robust evaluations. Yet when you look at you look at the data. I mean, here's my issue. Jack Welch once said, you get hiring right about 50% of the time. The question is what do you do when you get it wrong? If that holds true at the executive level, it's got to hold true at the management level. Yet look for the instances where somebody didn't stay on a board and didn't leave because of hitting mandatory retirement age. They're so few as to be appalling. And so while I think boards are getting in the right direction around these self-evaluations and they're taking baby steps there, it's not fast enough
That's
for the
kind of right
investors.
on point to what I was going to bring up. I think every board I'm on, we're always recruiting. We're always looking for another board member. And I think that every board should have that. It's just in the back of your mind as you meet people and you're involved in the industry, you ought to be thinking about, would this person fit on the board? Having said that, when a board member comes on, they go through there's kind of a process of when a board member comes on, and the first thing that they do is they come into the room and they always want to prove their value. And so there's this, I want to be the smartest person in this room. And the rest of the board that's been there, it basically kind of goes, why don't you give it a couple of meetings anyway. So I've almost invariably find that as soon as a board member comes on, you almost immediately have buyer's remorse. But I've also learned that let that play out for a while. Because boards by their nature we're only together once a quarter. And you know, that's hardly, you know, a lot of time to build a good working relationship and to get somebody to have the trust and confidence that you can basically sit them down and say, you know, you ought to shut up a little bit more. And I'm guilty of it too. I've had a chairman of the board said, like I said, one chairman said, at the same time, was in a matter of weeks with each other, one chairman said, I need you to talk up, and the other one said, you know, you might want to just tone it down a bit. And I personally thought I was doing the same in both meetings, so it's perception, I guess. But I do think, and to the point Ted made, we've got the matrix out, we know what we're looking for. We also are looking for, obviously, to get as much diversity on the board as we can. But having said that, and I think this is where a lot of the wheels come off on the diversity issues. First and foremost, the person has to bring value to the board. It's not just, I want to check that box. And I'll use women on boards as an example. So one of the boards I'm on, Robin Abrams is on the board, and I think some of you know, I've had her out to do a couple of conversations. I love her. I think she's like the best person in the world on a board, and she loves me. So we get along really well. But her comment is, and not anymore, because if you've been in a boardroom with her, you know the value that she brings. But she said originally it was like, I was just a check the box. You know what? Okay, I need a woman. Robin's been a CEO of a company, I got a woman on the board. And she said, and then you start trying to figure out, you got to prove your value to the company. And then she said, then I finally got to the point, it's like, the heck with that, I don't need to prove my value to anybody. And today, I've been on the board with her in a couple of situations. She is without a doubt one of the most valued board members that we have. And she's kind of let all of that stuff kind of get behind her. So I just caution everybody as we think about it, and I'll make one final comment around activists as it relates to the composition of the board. That is, you just identified their favorite target.
Yep.
And you see it in tech all the time. Companies got to 250 million, 300 million in revenue. It's the founders are still in charge of the company. The board's made up of friends and family, and you know, there's really nobody's come or left the board, and everything's just kind of cozy. And the activist shareholders love that situation because your major shareholders would vote you out in a heartbeat if someone would come in and actually put a slate in the company that was going to do something. So you're finding most of the tech companies, because this is what I'm familiar with, I don't know if the other industries are like this, but the people have finally awakened to the fact if I'm not making this board, you know, turning this board over pretty fast and getting the right people on here, somebody's going to come in here who will.
I mean, the bigger challenge gets back to courage when you talked about the director evaluations, because, you know, will somebody step up and say, it's been great that you've been with us for 10 years, but either we've pivoted our strategy, we've gone in another direction, and it's time to move on. And if boards would do that, I think they'd wring out a lot of the dysfunction that's out there, because what then happens is if an activist is there, they start going through this director evaluation process, which really should just be a gift to give people feedback. And when you take director evaluation and use it for director assassination, you've really got a problem, because the reality is I could put a list and make everybody on the boardroom table force rank everyone 1 to 10. And you know, other than the bottom 3 people ranking themselves number 1, we're going to have almost complete alignment from everyone on the board in terms of who adds value. So let's have nominating and governance committees be thinking about who we've run into, who we can replace and continually replenish the board over time, and thank people for their service and figure out a graceful way to move them on. But the reality is most boards are more willing to fire the CEO than they are willing to get rid of one of their own.
That's true.
In terms of term limit, one new observation in those industry with fast changing technologies that when they bring a new board member, they reach agreement with a new board member saying that after 8 to 10 years, you will submit a resignation letter saying that I resign. So that's it's a new practice probably in the governance. You know, asking the new board member bringing and they agree to resign after certain number of years, so that it makes sure that the board turnover, and then they can bring new people into the board.
I want to be respectful of your time and our time as well. terrific discussion. Thank you all very much for your participation. Ted, Mark, Tracy, thank you very much for helping us set the stage and providing your insights and your experience. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.